your vote now. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you, David. So welcome, Hari Mai, this meeting of the Regulatory Committee for Environment Southland. I've asked for any apologies, and I have one here from Councillor Major.
Nickel for lateness.
Chairman Nickel will be a little bit late.
I'll move this.
Thank you. Moved and seconded. Everybody in favour? Right. Good. Any declarations of interest about matters before the committee today that had been previously declared? If not, we'll move on. Any public forums, petitions and deputations? There's no public present, so it's difficult for them, I suppose, to make presentations to us in Māori.
Well,
So the answer is none. The confirmation of the minutes from the last meeting, which was on the 17th of February. Somebody who was present would like to move that's a correct record of those minutes. Thank you, Jeremy. Seconded by
Do you want a second? I'll second
Lloyd.
Yeah.
Big Lloyd.
it.
Big Lloyd, thank you. Is there any discussion on that? If not, put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Thank you. Done. Just for the people who are online, it would be useful to me, because I'm not looking at you, you're on the screen behind me, if you use the reaction thing and stick a little hand on the screen if you want to speak, please. Right, items. Notation of extraordinary and urgent business. Supplementary reports. None? No. Any questions?
I'll just make a comment, Mr. Chairman. I am getting one or two phone calls about consenting procedures, which I've referred to Bruce. Bruce said a couple, but there are some people who, if I said this as nice as I could, are finding some of the consultants not as easy to work with as what they thought. And they aren't being told clearly what the procedures are with the half-hour, free consultation, the explanation of the process, what is required, what is not, the finding of historical information. I'm talking specifically around irrigation bores when I say that, but there seems to be a lack of sort of general knowledge sort of stuff that would actually help the applicant through the process. I don't know if there's a way to get around that, but it's just a comment. I'm fielding more calls like that than is what I thought would be, that should be, basically. So if there was something that we could give people who were going into the process, we do a 6 month or a pre-notice to a lot of the renewals, just to remind people that this is what you will need to do, and the offer of us helping, and we can also help with a more paid content if you need more fuller information, and you can come more than once, So maybe just a reminder for that sort of stuff. I think there is one or two that are feeling that the consultants aren't necessarily working for them, they're working for themselves. And we need to make sure that Bruce gets the right information, but it's not a phone book of stuff that is nice to have, but is not actually essential to have. So just a couple of things, Mr. Chairman, but I think we just need to try and make sure that process is more seamless.
Maybe for you, Mr. Chair, Bruce could respond at least to some of the initial thoughts that you may have on that.
Yeah, Bruce, you were on the radio yesterday talking about the periphery of this.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chairman. I understand what Councillor McKellam's raising, and interestingly enough, we have a regular consultants forum which meets monthly, and we've had some pretty good dialogue around some of these issues. And the consultants have actually highlighted the fact that a number of them are extremely busy and have quite a lengthy workload and some backlog that they're looking to deal with. Generally, our relationship with the local consultants is good. Some of the specific issues around things like historical water takes and things are things that sometimes will take us some reasonable effort and time to locate that information. And I can think of one in particular at the moment, which relates to the extent of an aquifer and the number of takes within that aquifer. That's quite a significant information request, which our science team has been working through. So as Councillor McCallum's highlighted, it certainly helps if we get a heads up and we can talk to people in that pre-application meeting process which is free for the first 30 minutes. If it runs to 40 minutes, we're pretty liberal around the charging aspect of that. But if people come back like 5 or 6 times, we're likely to charge them. But it's about trying to facilitate the process and make it easy. So it certainly helps if we have the opportunity to have a pre-application meeting and it's scheduled, and we can round out some of that background information in advance, and that sort of streamlines that discussion so people know who's coming in, what they want to know, what history might be relevant, particularly when we've got a reasonably new team, most of whom may not have been around 5 or 6 years ago if there's a process that happened in that time.
Thank you,
Mr.
Bruce.
Chairman.
Councillor Beard.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. So just a bit of a follow-on question in relation to that, I guess in a timing sense. If a consent holder was seeing that their consent maybe was getting closer to expiring, how many months in advance then do you think that they should be acting to get underway with the consultant if there's a bit of a lag there with workflow and obviously processing time for ourselves? Let's say in a dairy example.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chairman, I'd say they'd be wanting to sort of progress things a good year in advance. Like, as I think you're probably aware, they have to lodge the new application at least 6 months in advance to have what's called Section 124 nights under the RMA, where they continue under their existing consent while their new consent's resolved. But based on that dialogue we had with consultants, we recently sent out an amended letter that sort of stressed that and said, hey, consultants are really busy, the sector is really busy, so we suggest that you as consent holders get onto this early, and I'd say a minimum of a year is probably a good time frame so that everybody's got plenty of time. Like, applications need quite a lot of supporting information, and things like a pond dot test on a dairy effluent pond, for example, there can be like a 6-month waiting list to get a consultant to undertake that pond drop test. So that's a small example of something that can create a delay to the process and sort of run things to the wire timeframe wise. So I've been working with the consultants around that messaging. We can send you a copy of that letter if you're interested, just so you see what's going on.
Thank you, Bruce. I have a question just to clarify my mind. I had a call from a farmer complaining about wilding pines coming onto his property from a neighbouring forestry block, and want to know what we were going to do about it, and if we'd consented it, what were the rules. And I didn't believe we consented forestry blocks, but can you clarify that for me? I actually referred him to you.
Haven't heard from him yet, but I'll do my best, Mr. Chairman. We don't have a specific role normally in the consenting of forestry plantations. So, for instance, Douglas fir has been a specific species that's been linked to a wilding issue. But when my previous role at Southern District Council, we did have a consenting role, and one, for example, I can think of was in the Upper Matara area, large commercial Douglas fir plantation, and there were consent conditions imposed where the owner of the plantation had to do a sweep with neighbours' approvals of the neighbouring properties and remove those at seedling stage. There is a national environmental standard for plantation forestry which covers wilding and wilding risk. We have some limited role in that, so we don't have a lot of statutory power to require that sort of removal. Southern District Council, the territorial authorities, do have some powers in that regard under the district plan and the national environmental standard.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's the area that the gentleman was discussing with me. You'll be able to
Mr. Chairman, there have been some reasonably strong concerns around wilding around that part of the world. Obviously, you'll be aware of the historical mid-dome situation, but it is the wind can really whistle through that area. It's sort of what I guess you'd call a high takeoff zone for some of those species planted up around 800 metres in altitude.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Hessler.
That's the point I was going to make, that those seeds can travel a very long way and they can skip the neighbour's property and move well into conservation land. Ongoing problem with Douglas fir because it's just so mobile with those airborne seeds.
Right, thank you. Thank you, Bruce. Chairman.
Yeah, just on that issue, we did complain at the time that the NES plantain forestry is a bit weak. It talks about only a very short distance from the boundary, and it's always been a weakness that they're supposed to be doing a review, but so far we haven't seen that review, because it is a real concern that happy with plantation forestry, but if it's in the wrong place and there seems to be very little responsibility going back to the landowners for some of that thing, which is a concern.
Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I suspect Bruce will be liaising with our territorial authority colleagues if that complaint does come through. So we'll do our utmost to make sure that it's passed on at the very least.
Okay, thank you. Right, that was item 7, Chairman. Item 8 is the Chairman and Council's reports. I don't have any reports. Any councillors have any reports? If not, we'll move along. Item 9 is the General Manager Catchment Management Report. And the item 1 of that is the consents, team activity and performance.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and I think Bruce is ready to go and present the consents update.
You're on, Bruce.
Yeah, thanks for you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, councillors. I'll take the report as read. Just in consultation with Mr. Hulse, change the focus of this slightly to be seek to be a little bit more future focused and highlight some emerging issues and some more focus on where legislation is heading. Hopefully the report itself is reasonably self-explanatory. I might just move through and highlight a few matters for your attention. Probably the first one would be the top of page 11 around legislative reform. Not sure if you had a look at that link, but the link basically refers through from April 2022 to the most recent update from the Ministry of the Environment for the progression around RMA reform, and in particular the Natural and Built Environments Act, which is called the NBA for some reason, not the NBEA, not quite sure why. Where that's at, there was a consultation draft released last year, sort of what they call an exposure draft, and sought feedback, and there's a summary in that link of the parties that provided feedback. Also happening at the same time, there's a local government reference group that's informing that development of that legislation. And if you happen to click on the link within the link, there's a reference, there's a link to that working group. And interestingly enough, one of the key things they're focusing on is how they can ensure local democracy feeds through to the development of plans and the implementation of the new legislation. So that's been quite interesting to see that gestation of that new piece of really important legislation. And I'll certainly keep you posted as that develops. Just sort of perhaps moving through on pages, bottom of page 13 through to page 15, we've got a summary of some of our key applications we've been dealing with. Probably a highlight of the last quarter has been quite a number of matters proceeding to a hearing, mostly via Zoom, not totally, but we did have the Southport hearing in person here just before Easter. The Zoom technology has worked really well. But another interesting feature is a number of those applications have been either publicly notified or limited notified. And we've had submissions, but through some further dialogue, quite often the parties, the applicant and the submitter and ourselves have been able to work through some level of consensus or agreement. But then it has progressed to an independent commissioner for formalisation. So some reasonably positive outcomes happening through those processes. That process has probably minimised the extent of hearing time required and the associated administration and costs that go with that. Just sort of moving through some of the timeliness of decision aspects. Generally speaking, things have been moving through pretty promptly. Really appreciate the support we've had from the IT team when we've been mostly working from home over the last quarter. That technology's worked really well. Been fairly seamless and been able to keep work moving pretty well. Probably the other item I would highlight just around key challenges is ongoing source of, I guess, some tension in our process would be quite often we're referring parties, consent applicants to other parties to get written approvals. And some of those parties that are referred to regularly, there's been some delays in response times for things like, the small agencies, quite often they've had people affected by COVID, which is obviously out of their control. But there's some level of frustration at times from applicants and their consultants around response times from some of the statutory agencies. And we've been looking to try and work through that in a positive way. But it does reflect on people's experience of our consent process, because if they take, we might process our part of it in the time frame, but if they take weeks and weeks and weeks to get another party's written approval, then that can create quite a level of frustration. So some of the team have been fielding those sorts of concerns, as I have. So we're looking to do what we can to try and make the process as clear as possible and sort of ease some of those pressures. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Bruce. Just a question about your last commentary there. Is it part of our role to encourage those other submitters to actually play their part in a timely manner? Or is that up to the applicant to push that along?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think it's a bit of both, but certainly we can look at how applications are being conveyed to them. And for instance, Te Ao Marama, as the key representative of Tangata Whenua, receives a lot of applications, and they're a small team, and so they're quite under a lot of pressure at times. So we've been discussing with consultants how we could potentially streamline some of those processes. And obviously we need to make sure that Tangata Whenua are comfortable with whatever we're proposing to do. So the dialogue in the first instance should be with Tangata Whenua through Te Ao Marama, and then we can work through those issues, hopefully in a constructive way. It's important that Tangata Whenua are involved in these decision-making processes. So I've certainly given no undertaking or anything to any other parties that will be seeking to cut Tangata Whenua out. That's just not going to happen. So they've got a key, very, very important role. So people need to recognise that, but there might be opportunities to streamline those communications mechanisms and potentially work with Tangata Whenua if there's consent applications that they are seeing that they don't have a particularly strong interest in. We might be able to, for want of a better word, sort of narrow the field a little bit for them.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce. Councillor Baird.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. So I was just going to raise a question on the top of, or the bottom of, sorry, page 10 regarding the hydrogen matters that you've discussed, and I'm pleased you are discussing the hydrogen matters. I think the key areas we're going to be able to lower our carbon use, and particularly in heavy transport. And I'd just like to know that whether we are, or inquire as to whether we are delving as deep as we perhaps need to be. Are we engaging, talking with Steve Kenny, Great South, over what we need to do to ensure that I believe our door should be open for further development of hydrogen fuels. I don't want it to seem to be like the aquaculture, which seems to have dragged on, and every report we seem to see is a difficulty in getting the aquaculture going. So I wouldn't like to think that was going to happen with hydrogen. So just further comments on our knowledge base.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chairman. We've had some recent dialogue with Steve and Great South, both myself and Rachel Miller from our strategy and policy team. And there's also been dialogue between Great South and I think the chairman and the former chief executive and acting chief executive about the direction of travel on that work. No hydrogen proposals or any applications have been lodged as yet. So, but I'm just really flagging that this is potentially an issue that is very significant in terms of consenting processes. It's had quite a bit of coverage both locally and nationally recently. So probably really signalling that the consents team is aware of this issue and the magnitude of it potentially for Southland. And recently, obviously, with the Prime Minister's visit to Japan and the hydrogen car trial in Auckland, for instance, being a really live recent example of this technology moving to New Zealand quite quickly. So want to make sure that those sorts of issues, that the consents team is across those and alive to them in the Southern context.
Thank you, Bruce. I just noted on the radio this morning that the America's Cup team chase boats are all hydrogen powered, and they've been out testing them around Auckland. Councillor Guyton.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, just further to the hydrogen, I notice a comment from Tiwai Aluminium smelters that they are looking at wresting control of the hydrogen issue here in Southland to their own gain. It seemed to me they're making noise about them using their site at Tiwai to produce the hydrogen, I guess at their profit. I don't know how significant that statement is, but it was made in the paper just a couple of days ago.
Yeah, thank you. Chairman Horrell.
Well, just on that one for a start, we were at the meeting and that was not the message that was conveyed at all. Their comment was that they felt there was room for hydrogen development and they supported it in Southland as well as they were continuing. We had nothing at that meeting that suggested that they were going to be producing hydrogen on that site. So I'm not sure whether it was inaccurate reporting. But on that same topic, some people may have seen on the news in the last couple of days, there's a Taranaki group that are quite well advanced with hydrogen production and are now looking at setting up 3 refuelling stations around the North Island, which they believe will give 500k distances for heavy transport. So this is actually moving at pace. The price of fuel is going to make it happen a lot quicker than we probably previously thought, but it's certainly a live debate, and it's moving at pace, which is really interesting.
The way the diesel price is going, Chairman, I think it might come sooner rather than later. Yes, Councillor McKellen.
Couple 3 comments. I think whether the hydrogen production is on site at Tiwai or not, it has to be basically green energy. I think the one up north is actually steam, otherwise it's not viable. So I think there's a lot of discussions to have about where the site is and how it's generated and how it works in with other databases and Tiwai demands and those sorts of things. Probably 2 or 3 comments really to Bruce through you, Mr. Chairman. The iwi sign-off one, as you know, Bruce, I've had one of those that I've been dealing with as well. I'm just wondering whether, are we getting to iwi soon enough in the process? That particular one seemed to be late in the process before it came up, so I'm just wondering whether we can do something there. The RMA one, I think it's bigger than just the consenting team. This is ES interaction with the RMA reform, and I think the basic principles was we were going to fix some issues and make it faster and more seamless for the user so that we had the outcomes we wanted. It looks like to me it's got into a quagmire and it's going to be even worse than what we had before, so I'm really concerned about where that's going. So if we could be kept in the loop as far as a yes response to the RMA reform, I think is where we should have our commentary, not just in the consenting department. But it's good to hear your views on that as well, Bruce. I just wondered with your comments that with the pre-meetings weren't used enough or exercised enough, if we're doing effectively consenting hearings and then we're doing effectively pre-meetings before the consent hearing, whether we should be exploring that a bit more to bring the parties together and understand their concerns. And I read in the paper that we're up to 15% outsourced now. Where do you see that going, and is that going to be a further ongoing issue that we have? Bear in mind that the consultants are busy anyway. If we're going to outsource to them, that actually adds to their workload, which is not necessarily what we want.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chairman, I think there's 4 questions there, so I might see if I can deal with them in turn. First one about getting to the iwi agencies early enough. Yes, good comment, good pertinent comment. When we get an application in, we have to decide who are the affected parties, and I'd say 95% of the time now, Tangata Whenua would be considered an affected party. So it's important that as early as we can in the process, we make consent applicants aware of that. And the other part of that also is that we've had some dialogue with the Consultants Forum about the fact that quite often, if a proposal is consulted between the applicant and their consultant and Te Ao Marama or Hokanui, Runanga, before it's lodged, it can be structured in such a way that Tangata Whenua are agreeable to it, or it's more agreeable to Tangata Whenua. and that can streamline that process as well. So there's two elements. One is us letting applicants know of that requirement as soon as we can in the process. The second part of it is the potential for preliminary consultation by applicants with tangata whenua before it's even lodged with us. So yeah, so fully agree with Councillor McCallum's comment there. Second issue.
Bruce, can I just add there, just before you move on, if I may, I think there's reluctance from the general public because they don't know how to interact with iwi. They don't know who the right person to go to is, and I think they find that process a little bit daunting. And I'm just wondering, I think you've made, your points are quite valid. If we do it, or the consultants who have a relationship there do it, I think that's a nice way, a proper professional way to do it. So you know, I just think there's something in there that we just need to be aware of. Thank you.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chairman, yeah, I agree with that. And as I've indicated to the Consultants Forum, we have a role here in not making the process harder than it needs to be, but they also have a role in terms of recognising that tangata whenua issues are at the forefront of our decision making and potentially undertaking preliminary consultation, which can make sure that what their client is wanting to do can be structured in a manner that recognises tangata whenua perspectives. Just move on to the second comment about RMA reform. Again, fully agree with Councillor McCallum. It is all of organisation issue, not just a consenting issue by any means. And the strategy and policy team prepared a all of organisation type submission following consultation with yourselves on this preliminary draft. So absolutely agree with that. Just probably the purpose of referencing it in this report was just to make sure you're aware that the consents team are keeping abreast of where the legislative reform is heading. It's a really important part of where we're heading over the next couple of years. In turn, the third question was around using pre-hearing meetings. And after submissions close, for instance, on application under section 99 of the RMA, we can convene a pre-hearing meeting where the applicant and the submitters get together. And some of you have been involved in those. In fact, some of you have probably chaired them, I think. And they can be really useful in terms of potentially resolving issues or at least narrowing issues. I don't think I've ever been at one where it's been worthless. Usually they at least narrow the issues before they get to a hearing. So they're quite worthwhile. There is usually a cost of that. Quite often they're undertaken by independent facilitators or hearing commissioners. And not all applicants either want to have a pre-hearing meeting or are willing to bear the cost of that. So, but we do try and promote them wherever we can see the potential benefit, because spending some time in a pre-hearing meeting, which is a bit less of a structured forum, and you can have some pretty open and frank dialogue around issues, can significantly reduce the amount of time required in the formal hearing process, which is a lot more structured, and there's no cross-examination, all that sort of thing. So yes, certainly some benefits, lots of benefits in using pre-hearing meetings, and we have been using them fairly regularly for the applications that may end up in a hearing situation. And the final question, I think, related to outsourcing and the extent of work that we're outsourcing to external consultants, which is sitting around the 10 to 15% mark for the last year or so. And I think Councillor McCallum's question is, would we bring that all in-house? I think, well, my personal view would be ideally we would, but there's a significant war on talent, as I mentioned in the report there. And we have got a number of complex applications, some of it which sit outside the scope of our more experienced staff to deal with. The more experienced team members have got a fair bit on their plates, and we need to balance their workloads and well-being with what we're being asked to deal with. And for instance, we've got a large application due to be lodged at the end of June, and I've made some outsourcing arrangements for that because the applicant wants it to crack on and get moving, and we would have a capacity issue around that.
Thank you, Bruce. Chairman Horrell, did you have a...
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, just comment on a couple of those things. I think when we have expertise in other councils around the countryside, that it's probably actually quite an efficient way of doing things where we can tap into expertise that's already there. On the iwi issue, I think we should be encouraging applicants to approach early and respectfully rather than the end of the process, because I don't think that helps. It's a minor issue, and while we have our role to do, I think the encouragement should be to make that approach early, and I've known a number where they've done that, and it's been a much smoother process than almost as an add-on, and I think that doesn't help the situation. But my question was actually, I see we have a couple of applications where they're on hold, waiting for the deposit payment. I was quite intrigued with that. Is this a delaying tactic, or I thought if somebody had an application, they would pay the deposit?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, so I don't think it's certainly not a delaying tactic on our part. When we close the period of submissions and there are submissions, then our schedule of fees and charges requires the payment of a hearing deposit before we progress through to the hearing stage. And as I'm sure you're aware, hearings involve some very significant costs for our organisation in terms of engaging commissioners and experts and things like that, and for other parties as well. So sometimes the parties will take a bit of a breath before they decide whether they want to head to a hearing or not. So that's usually an applicant decision as to whether they pay the deposit, but we won't schedule a hearing till that hearing deposit is paid. And I guess that's to some extent a cost risk mitigation measure for our ratepayers.
I wasn't suggesting that it was us doing the delaying tactic. I was just intrigued, but thanks for the answer.
Thank you. Are there any further questions or commentary?
Just have one on the, one of those applications is for air discharge for abrasive blasting. Is that normally covered, or was that a special incident or something? Like, would that apply for anything where you're sandblasting or putting something into the air, even if it's only a small area? Or was it a major structure?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, Pneumatic Contractors is one of the main contractors in Southland that does this work, and they're a commercial, it's a commercial scale air blasting where they use abrasives, like sandblasting, that sort of thing, and does have an air discharge component. So certainly for, somebody water blasting the paint off their house or something like that, that's not an issue. But this is more a commercial activity, and that has been through the process and, as you'll see, granted under delegated authority.
Could I assume on that one then that particular company are making an application to carry out a process, and it might be several jobs, not just on one day?
Yes, exactly. It's the ability to undertake that activity around Southland on an ongoing basis.
Thank you.
I'll move the report, Mr. Chairman.
Sorry, I have a hand up from Councillor Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just, I'm not sure whether Bruce can answer it, but I was just wondering where the Southport coastal, the application there for consent, just where it was at the moment. I'm not quite sure whether you can answer that, and the public are also privy. But yeah.
Yes, through you, Mr. Chairman, can answer that. There was a hearing held on the 12th and 13th of April here at the Council Chambers, which was live streamed. I think some of you may have tuned into that. Before two commissioners, Commissioner Sharon McGarry and Rob Liefering. The applicant has been asked to furnish some further information following the hearing, and they've got until the 8th of August to undertake that. So without speaking on their behalf, I expect they'll be cracking on with that and may well furnish that information prior to that date. But if you tuned into that hearing, you would have seen the commissioners asking quite a number of pertinent questions and seeking some clarification. And quite a good choice of commissioners, really. Both of them had quite extensive port-related experience, so it wasn't a new area for them, and they drew out some questioning of the applicant and have asked for some further information.
Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you. Yes, Lloyd.
So I'd like to move the report, but I have a question first, which is not actually in the papers, but it's a bigger, wider question. And Bruce, you may want to come back to us. A number of the council have done the Good Decisions course, but the use of that course in their day-to-day activity of being a councillor and being on hearings, apart from one major one, we've had very limited use of that resource, and it is quite a cost to go through that process. And the consent hearing commissioners we're using for a lot of the stuff now, we've purposely gone outside of our own council pool for a whole lot of, and I'm not saying they're right or wrong, like, for a whole lot of good reasons, we've done that. Do you want to put some thinking into how many do we need and what is the level that is comfortable for this council going forward? I know that you, Chairman, have a not only that role plus a chairman's role in that, and there's probably one other. I think Lyndall's the other one that has that as well. But I'm just wondering where that sits. It's changed a lot since I've been on council.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chairman, can I respond to that a little bit, but I'll do some further work on it and come back to you. Obviously, Councillor Cook and myself have discussed this and the desire to involve councillors in decision making as much as is feasible, and certainly conscious of that. An example last year was one that Councillor Ludlow was involved with for a new commercial quarry and clean fuel disposal site up north of Fairlight. Some of the issues that can negate that somewhat, for example, with Southport, obviously with Environment Southland being a shareholder, we had to engage independent commissioners, and quite often, surprisingly often actually, there'll be a conflict of interest issue that precludes a councillor being involved, but certainly we're keen to provide that opportunity as much as we can, and very conscious of that. But I can certainly also aware of what Councillor McCallum's saying is that the Making Good Decisions program through the Ministry of Environment does involve some significant costs to the organisation, and also a not inconsiderable amount of time for the people undertaking that training. It's quite a time constraint, and then you have a certificate that you need to keep up. So yeah, I'll bring a further paper back probably to seek your feedback on that. I don't think there's any hard and fast rule on it, but certainly conscious of what you're saying. And it has been an interesting progression probably right around the country when I was first involved in resource consent hearings, which certainly wasn't yesterday now, but usually mostly councillor panels, and those have moved rightly or wrongly over the years to panels mostly made up of professional hearing commissioners, sometimes with a council representative, and that's been probably a national trend, not just a Southland region trend.
Yeah. I'm still happy. Thanks, Bruce.
Yeah, well, I support what you're saying, and Bruce and I have discussed this on several occasions, and we do, when applications for consents come in, then we consider it from the point of view of if we're going to bring in commissioners, can councillors also be part of that, because the majority of the councillors have actually completed the course, and Councillor Ludlow and myself have chair certificates as well.
And
it's a shame to waste
it. I run out in December, but I haven't actually used it really, and I'm going, do I want to put the organisation through that cost? And if so, can it be used? If it's not going to be used, why would I have it? So yeah, and there's quite
Councillor Ludlow and Councillor Major have both been involved during this term, but there's not nearly as often as it used to be. We used to have a lot more hearings. Thank you. And now you've moved of the recommendation. We have a seconder for that, please. Councillor McFarlane. Any further discussion or questions? If not, I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Anyone against? Done. Thank you, Bruce.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, just before we move on, the paper I prepared and Donna's paper, both of those sort of fell between the cracks between the announcements recently around intensive winter grazing regulation changes, which came out on the 28th of April. If you like, at the conclusion of the formal agenda, we could give you a quick verbal update on that. I think Chairman Horrell's given some really good coverage, so you may be already fully across it, but we could take you through the key changes if you like at the end.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
So item 2 is compliance division with Donna. Welcome, Donna. You're muted.
Apologies. Atamaria Committee, through you, Mr. Chair, I would like to table the report as read. Highlight a couple of items within the report and a couple that have come to light since the writing of the report. Air incidents are remaining between 47 and 49% of all incidents called in. A theme we are noticing at the moment is calls are coming through to our team post-event. So we're going to be working closely with our communication team to make sure that we can re-educate our community to make sure they come through at the time so we're able to act on those. Our new daytime response officer has also started in our team and is undergoing training at the moment to be able to pick that role back up. In the meantime, it's being covered by all of our other warranted officers just to make sure that that service is still available to our community. Winter grazing is forefront of everyone's mind at the moment. So we're working really closely with the rest of the organisation in an integrated catchment model response for this season. And compliance is currently putting the final touches to our plan for our roadside assessments, for our flights and for our monitoring events, and also some communications planned for the season for if and when we get major weather events, which we're no doubtedly going to get. Since the writing of the report, we had the water shortage direction and a number of the compliance team were redeployed from BAU to be able to assist with that. So that involved being part of the water shortage group, which was happening inside of council for a long period of time, but also to the incident management team, which issued and monitored the water shortage direction. We also stood up a number of our team to be on standby for roadside assessments following any notifications of irrigation during that period of time and to enable any enforcement that needed to happen. None of that was required. We noted a really high compliance with the water shortage direction, and even prior to the water shortage direction being issued, we noted a couple of large irrigators reduce the use down to 25% of their allocated abstraction volumes because of the communications which had gone out noting the water shortage. During that period of time, we noticed a couple of calls come in from the community pointing out they held storage ponds and giving us advice on what days they would be utilising that. So if we got calls, we had that at hand and we were able to then contact that consent holder and to say we had had a call and keep in communication. So we wanted to thank the community for keeping us abreast of all of those issues so we could actually give good responses to the people that were calling. We have also finished up our 5-year plan for the 5 years work programs for compliance, and it's ready to present to council in the coming months. And we've also finished off our compliance monitoring and enforcement operational strategy for 2022 and 23, along with our annual priorities. And those will be workshopped with council, I believe, in June. This workshopping on the strategy and our priorities is something we want to do every year moving forward to make sure our work programs are current, transparent, and to make sure everyone knows what's happening. Open to any questions.
Thank you for that report, Donna. We've announced that we're going to be conducting flights. How are those going to be done? Because any aircraft that flies over becomes one of ours in the eyes of some of the landowners. Any drone that's anywhere around is ours. How are we actually doing it?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So we do have estimated flight dates, which we'll be able to communicate to let people know when we're up and what we're doing. We have estimated flight plans. So for the first 2 flights, we will follow previous year's routes. And the third flight, we'll be looking at trying to time either with a weather event or areas of non-compliance, which we've historically found. At this stage, drones are not planned to be used during their winter grazing response in anything other than incident response, and it will be done with the communication of the landowner and by certified pilots.
So we're using fixed wing or helicopters?
Through you, Mr. Chair, helicopters.
We're over the fair place all the time.
Chairman Horrell.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, this is a topical issue. I did about an 18-minute interview with Andy Thompson, who used to be on Hokanui. I'm not sure what the coverage is like in the south, but his last podcast had been with Angus Robson, who was a bit scathing about us, which I wasn't that happy about, saying that he had no confidence that we would enforce the regulations. And I made it quite clear that we've already done flights that result in education, but compliance will start as we go through. And I guess that it's good to get that one out about the drones, because if we were to use drones, we would actually give warning. And so we need to have a clear message out there that any drones, and we know the activists use them, are not from Environment Southland. And the other point I made was that we're actually looking for compliance rather than non-compliance. But when we find non-compliance, certainly we will use the tools we have. I believe we've made a lot of progress over the last 2 or 3 years in the education field, and just having all the agencies giving the same message, I think, is really powerful. But we know that there'll be people out there that not have got the message or won't have that plan B in place. And I guess that messaging should be going out now. We know with a dry summer that could exacerbate some issues going into the winter or later in the winter. We are hopeful we'll have a really good result. But but I guess we're trying to get the message out to the public. Act early, ask for advice early if you think you're going to have an issue. But driving around the countryside, you can see a lot of uptake of critical source areas, etc., which I think will help this year.
Thank you, Nicol. Councillor Beard.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. So thanks for the report, Donna. The top of page 18, regarding the staff working with the Environmental Protection Agency. So are they on the ground now understanding some of our processes, or are they going to turn up in some point of the winter when it may suit them, or it may suit us to then understand more what's going on? Because I do understand that there's been active work with some of the farming people to help facilitate, engage, grow the knowledge of our staff when it comes to knowing what to look for when winter cropping. So are the EPA going to come in with knowledge of what to look for, or are they going to be growing their knowledge when and if they arrive?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. That's a good question. So we're currently working with EPA to upskill our staff, but also to upskill some of theirs. They're very open to the feedback that a winter down this end of the country can be quite different to winters elsewhere. So they want to work in a supportive educational process with us. We're having some conversations with them prior to them arriving, if they're able to come down. COVID has affected them. They were hoping to have been here already to do a bit of looking around Southland. So we're having those conversations in the next few weeks, hopefully to do a bit of upskilling and planning. So I'll be able to report back to the committee next meeting.
Maybe I could add on that. We are the regulator, and so our regulatory responsibilities will continue to be ours. The desire for the EPA is really much that understanding the Southland context. So they're coming down to work in partnership with us to understand the complexities and the difficulties around influenza grain. So they're upskilling their own team. So it's more of a watch and see how we progress type of relationship at this moment in time.
Thank you, Paul. Councillor Esler.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just inquiring about fires. We've got that seasonal fire ban in Invercargill at the moment. Now, for breaches of that, does the City Council have a role in that at all, or is it just us? And then do we sort of have the fire brigade at our beck and call if there's a sort of an incident where somebody's burning illegally and sort of not cooperative with that? Do we have any examples of that?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So, Fire and Emergency New Zealand are available if an outdoor fire is going to affect people or property, and we have a collegial working relationship with them around that, and also an education phase. We have utilised them in the past where fires have been either out of control or they've declined to put it out for us. That is a last resort, obviously, but it has been used in the past. And regarding the chimneys, so we monitor the breaches of our air plan, but Invercargill City Council, we are beginning work with around the installation of approved fires for those who don't have that. So that is a piece of work that is ongoing for us at the moment.
Thank you. Councillor Stevens, with your hand up.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a query actually regarding, I understand the deer industry held a field day to upskill, and I'm not quite sure whether it was upskill the ES staff or I understand also MPI were attended as well. I just wondered what value the staff got out of that, and whether other sectors do the same sort of thing.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I understand it. Well, I didn't personally attend, but I understand there was a lot of knowledge gained from those days. But Deer NZ have recently also held a workshop day. The deer industry is not something a lot of our officers or our staff are well known. We don't know a lot about it. So we have attended that and learnt an awful lot around deer and winter grazing and why we don't back fence deer. So we're hoping the industry continue with those workshops.
Thanks, Donna. No, it's just good to get that feedback. Thanks.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, also the consents team had a representative, Sol Kim, who went to that field day as well and shared his learnings with the consents team. So yeah, very worthwhile. Excellent event.
Councillor McKellar.
Yeah, two or three things, Mr. Chairman, if I may. I understand that the MPI is actually a stock health response. So when we go in there, there's two things to look at. One is what state is the stock in, regardless of what they are, and we look at how the stock are managed. So that's why EPA are involved. And we work with the team, I understand, was the issues last year that we followed up on. One of the questions in the back of my mind is, and you may be able to help me here, is did the conservation order actually make a difference that we put in place? I know what it was trying to achieve, but I'm not sure whether did we see a response, in a physical response in their action. In the back of my mind is the question is, if we had the same situation again, would we use that tool or another tool, or would we use it in a different way? So that's, you may want to come back to me on that one.
Yeah.
But I think we as a council need to ask ourselves, if we're going to use a tool, was it effective? And did it actually achieve the goal in which we said it was going to? I think the emergency management response was actually the right place for it to go. And I think we learned that can be used for other things than just floods. I think that's very positive from working with multiple sectors. My next comment really is, I think we need to, in some respects, over-communicate, but we need to tell people we're going to do 3 flights, and paddocks are starting to be set up now. They need to know that we're going to be over there in some form or another, either by road or air, looking at the activity and be quite open about it, in multiple media outlets would be my recommendation. I'm also aware that at least 2 irrigators didn't stop, and I don't think they were pond related. So there was a little bit of, Donna, you've got a good response, and there was another number of communications come in. Others played you never told me directly, so I'm going to carry on game. So we need to be aware of that. And my last comment is that when that tractor turned over in the Lockhill stream a couple of days ago, our team turned up, but I'm not sure whether we did our job as well as we could have for a upside down tractor in an internal stream. I think we need to look at our response to that, and I can give you more detail of that offline, but I just wonder, there was quite a bit of activity, the road was closed, there was a number of things going on, and if we're going to turn up to those instances with possible diesel and oil going down the stream, we need to have a more targeted response into that.
I'll comment if that's okay through you,
Thanks,
Chair. In terms of the Water Shortage Direction, I think we've agreed and committed to reviewing the processes in terms of reference and most crucially the communications that need to, if it was ever to happen again, and a reflection as well over the actual mechanics of stopping irrigation. So those things are front and centre of our thoughts for if we're ever in that, and hopefully never, but if we're ever in that situation again. I think in terms of the fact, the nature of this situation with unprecedented drought, the longest period of dryness on record, and the way that in the main the community responded was positive. The use of the internal external working group was again positive, but I think that the protection of the water bodies and the protection of industry and drinking water and stock water was all valid and sensible. I think if this was to happen again, and this would be part of the terms of reference, that crucially that 72 hours that we will looking to build into the programme will I think make a difference. It'll allow for debate, it'll allow for irrigation companies maybe to engage with a little bit, it'll allow for council to be part of that debate. So I think, and then within that 72, let's say, period of contemplation, whether there are alternatives, and I think that may be something that the council would like to, as we work through that work, have some comments on. With regards to, I'll let Donna talk about the incident. We'll answer statement 4. Donna, have you got a response to the incident?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Firstly, regarding the flights, we have started communications indicating the first week of each month, June, July and August, we'll be flying. That's an early indication because it is totally weather dependent about being able to put staff up in a helicopter. But we are working closely with our communication team to make sure that closer to the time, we're able to give more indication around specific dates and areas that we'll be flying. Regarding the incident, more than happy to have a conversation offline regarding that. It's just been in the last couple of days, so more than happy to discuss that.
Just answer one of your questions there about emergency management. The drought was not the kind of incident envisaged by the emergency management civil defence legislation. It did not fit in with the criteria for that. However, having said that, we had a meeting with the Minister, Kiripati Allen, recently, and one of the changes that government are considering putting in civil defence legislation is the management of incidents which don't amount to what is currently considered an emergency. So the drought would then probably come under that kind of legislation, adjustment to the legislation, giving powers to actually do things.
I think, Mr. Chairman, my comment is from the fact that that organisation, if I call it that, has the ability to do a lot of social connections that this is not our day-to-day business. And if we can use that in a non-life-threatening, because that seemed to be the hurdle, that was the test, the non-life-threatening regime like a flood or a major earthquake. If we can use that tool and use some of the skills that they have in there, I think we should utilise that. Now, if we need to make some changes or whatever, or fund it slightly different for that, that's okay. But I think we've got an asset there. I think we can use a little bit differently to actually help the community go through an experience like this, because it's multi-agency, multitasking across a wide spectrum. So I think it's positive, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for your comments around
Minister's looking at how do we use these things more going forward, I think that's positive.
Well, we gave some examples to the Minister of where we used the organisation short of emergency, and the Velvet Leaf and the Bovis were two prime examples of that, where we activated the staff over there to use their community contacts and their organisational expertise to assist MPI and other government agencies who came down here. So that's already happening, and they're happy to be involved, and they're set up to be involved. They just don't have any powers which might be conferred on them if an emergency was declared. That's the difference. Michael, did you want?
Well, just on that one, and we have lobbied the ministers perhaps for some funding for that role, because when the water shortage thing came along, the territorials wanted to actually declare a state of emergency, but actually can't unless it's an immediate threat to human health. But we do have the resource there, we'll use it for other things, and even the COVID response, the links they have. And again, it's actually making use of a resource. So, I would concur with Lloyd that if we're able to use that resource more widely, it actually, one it's training experience, but it's helped strengthen those links that we have with a whole range of agencies. So I think that's a good thing. Just go back to the EPA, I don't think we should be concerned with the EPA coming down. I think that's really good. And you've got Wellington watching the water grazing as well. I think that's a positive. A year or two ago, we had the EPA saying, look, we can come and do everything. The pushback from the regional sector was, we would prefer that we invited you when we needed you rather than doing something in competition. So I think that's healthy what's actually happening.
Jeremy.
Yeah, I won't dwell on the irrigation thing, say that, but I just take we are going to have a briefing, like a get together in regards to see how that all went. I take it that's still on the agenda and some with the council as such. But it does, the one thing that I'm just right to the what if scenarios. What if? There are always going to be a lot more of these things going to happen, and it's about trying to think outside the square and go, what's the worst thing that can happen, and how do we deal with these things? And probably from an irrigation perspective, we forgot to tell the applicants a wee bit that what if, and they need to know those things. And it's a bit in any consents that we have. So it'd be actually good to see if the council we've got a so-called booklet on, right, this is where we're heading, what if, and who do we need to bring along on the journey, who are the affected parties. So, and that can be over anything, a tractor falling into a ditch or a river, or it'd be good to know that we've got that all worked out. But I'm keen to sit down and work at some stage around the council table. That's these scenarios.
Thank you, Jeremy. Do we have any further questions or commentary?
That will move the recommendation, Mr. Chairman.
Jim Hall, seconded by Councillor McPhail. Thank you. Any other comments or queries? If not, we'll put the motion, please. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Is anyone against? That is carried. Thank you, Donna. Back to the agenda. Get over the page. Extraordinary and urgent business, there was none of that. And the public excluded business, there is no public excluded business today. In that case, I thank you for your attendance and your input to the meetings. Did somebody have a?
Bruce was going to give us a...
No, that's out of the meeting. It's not part of the agenda.
Okay. I did have questions in regards to that.
Yeah, no, it's just not part of the agenda, so that's a committee discussion, in committee discussion. But if you haven't notified it beforehand, you can't treat it as public excluded business.
Probably should have asked the question when he had his report.
Yeah. We hadn't notified that, so we can't include it.
It's the
rules, as I understand them.
New rules.
Well, the meeting is concluded.